was born and raised in Alabama. I went to a school called Tuskegee. My mother was a teacher. My father was an owner of a dry cleaners. And I grew up in this little village of 800 people. At the age of 9, I think I became a minister because I had this apparition one night, this vision that my grandfather, who was a minister, interpreted as a call to the ministry. I noticed this older photographer who had made these pictures of the 30s of farmers, very dignified images of farmers that I was very attracted to because it was an unusual image in the South. In media, all the images of people of color were very derogatory, but it reminded me of my aunts and uncles who were very dignified, and I couldn't hire a photographer to go make those pictures, so I asked him if he would teach me how to become a photographer. So a year later, I had learned enough. I bought my first camera and I went home to start making pictures because I wanted them to feel a sense of agency, of seeing themselves on their wall. The only thing they had on their wall was the Farmer's Almanac calendar and a picture of Jesus Christ. And I wanted to see their face when they saw themselves as something important enough to put on their walls that spoke to their own sense of self, their own sense of dignity and agency. And to me, that was seeing that moment in those old faces made all of that time that I had to invest and that money I had to invest in being a photographer worth it. Now, I really didn't have any plans other than just photographing my relatives, but the civil rights movement was going on, or I rather prefer as the human rights movement was going on. And I realized that there was a role to play because the imageries there again looked at the people who went on civil rights marches, not as American citizens petitioning their government. They looked at us as potential arsonists, rapists, and thugs. So I knew there was another story on the inside. And I didn't, so I had a job, and I also knew that my skill was inadequate to challenge this. So I went to New York my senior year, and I went looking for a teacher because there was no schools in photography. I was fortunate. I found a good teacher who was head of photography at Look magazine, and that whole summer, he taught me how to see. Taught me the linguistics of seeing. And then I went back and I was able to really look at my subject more dramatically and full of form that was competitive on the national stage that would do the subject matter more justice. I'm not a conflict photographer. My response was to look at what was this fight all about. It was about the personal worth and dignity of people. So I responded by photographing the people. Why are these children out here fighting? They're fighting because the dignity of their grandparents and their aunts and uncles that they've grown up around have value. So I'm looking at the value. I'm not looking at the flashpoints. And those values and those valuable people have been what my work has been all about. And I've said, okay, I have to see how I can make these images become a part of the national visual diet. Because the decision makers in this country need to see what is valuable to us. Because when you show flashpoints, that's good. That serves a purpose. But after the flashpoint, still, what is the issue here? The issue is that my people deserve the rights of humanity. Malcolm was right. This country has violated the laws of human rights of people of African descent, and they should be held to account for it. The first struggle is one of identity and memory. We African Americans, we are very unique in a lot of different ways. But there's, sadly, we are because of slavery and colonialism, we are Africans without memory and Americans without full rights. And growing up in this country, people, we are demonized so often that so few of us have, rather so many of us have developed this self-hate that the oppressor wants you to have, because you can't be fully oppressed and defeated unless you hate yourself. And since we live in a majority culture where we are in a minority, this is all around us. And so we are a little caught out in a very desperate, we may not realize it, but we're caught out in a very desperate situation because we don't have a sense of ownership to the land. We don't really have a sense of ownership to the place. So unless you can find a way, and we realize that white literature, white history has been totally inadequate because it's politicized against you. And the only way to free yourself from that first is to find a new anchoring. And that new anchoring is, well, who am I and where do I come from and where do I belong is really the question. If I don't belong here, where do I belong? And if where did I belong, is it I've been convinced by the majority culture to be ashamed of it. And be convinced that the people I come from have no value, which feeds into the racist narrative that you have no value. The only way to try to salvage yourself is then try to go down that dark tunnel of history, and hoping that in that dark tunnel of history you're not horrified, but it becomes a point of rescue. I say the three things that are always missing about people of color in this country in my time were issues of decency, dignity, and virtuous character. You could graph it out. So the images that I grew up looking at, whenever I saw an image of a Black person in the local press, they were always suspected felons or prostitutes. In the national press, and you still have it, where any kind of infringement of the law is maximized on local and national press, and any kind of successful and dignified, something to be respected of Black people is minimized. It's baked into the hardware and the software of being white. Well, you know, I'm traveling all over the world, and there are few things that are consistent about the world. One is that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and the other is that anywhere it's okay to hate Black people. My mentors did two things. First, they listened to me. I know Rothstein, when I went to see him first, he says, well, what do you want to do? I said, I want to change the visual image of people of color. He said, that's a big, he thought about that. He sat back in his chair. He said, well, that's a big task. I said, well, that's the only one I have. He said, okay, then let me see what you do. I'll help you get your eye together. Cornell Copper, the same way, realized, you know, all these guys, I think, respected the fact that I was very eager to learn. And I think as a mentor, what makes a mentor work is that you are a self-starter, that they don't really have to do the work for you. You're willing to do the work. They just have to give you advice and say, okay, you're going this way, you're going right, this way, you're going wrong. Try this idea over here. So Cornell Copper, who was with Magnum, head of Magnum, and started the International Center for Photography, put me to work on projects. Because, you know, people have to see what you do and have faith in that you can deliver, and put you in, because they can put you in situations. So Arthur Rothstein introduced me to Cornell Copper. He first started out by hiring me to do stories at Look magazine, and then Look folded. But he'd always been an angel for me. I go to Gordon, and Gordon says, okay, what do you want to do? I tell him the same thing, because Gordon, we are on the same boat. He had done this with life. So Gordon gave me a very good piece of advice. He says, look, Chester, I agree with you, and I wish you the best. Now, you know, there are 36 frames on a roll of film. When you get an assignment and you shoot 35 frames the way you're talking to me now, and you make a mistake and slip up and you shoot the 36th frame the way they've always seen it and expected, that's the one they're going to use. So don't give them a choice. You know, I did a film about that. I think it's on the web about my time at the Times. One of the most memorable things was photographing the celebration by Maya Angelou and Amira Baraka over the ashes of Langston Hughes in Harlem. But, you know, my purpose there was really brought home when Andrew Young, Ambassador Andrew Young, was dismissed as an ambassador because he met with the PLO without the Israeli consent, which is kind of strange. Why should we out-task, you know, our foreign policy to another government? But we had a picture. We had pictures of him at the White House meeting with Carter, surrendering his ambassador, UN ambassadorship. And we had pictures of him leaving in a car. And the leaving in a car scene made him look like he was a thief in the night. And there was a racist editor, night editor, who was in charge, because I was working at night as punishment, I think. But I was working at night, and I saw this picture, and I asked this editor, well, do we have a better picture than this? Well, I'm a photographer. I'm not an editor. And he said, no, this is the picture we're going to use. That's okay. I said, excuse me. I took the picture down, and I walked across the room to the managing editor's office, Abe Rosenthal, who had come to the Times from being a bureau chief in Japan. And I didn't know what I was going to say, but he's the guy who hired me. So he knew where I was coming from. And I went into his office and I said, Abe, I says, we never run a picture of an ambassador like this. He said, what do you mean? I said, this is the picture they want to run. He said, do we have other pictures? I said, yes, they do. He said, let's go over and see them. He went over, he deleted that picture, he picked another picture, and he told that racist guy, we're using this one. I did not use the word race because I think race is one of those shotgun terms that you need to be more specific about. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are a lot of people who are assholes, and they should be held to account for being an asshole. Mm-hmm. But be very specific about what it is so that they can't sneak out of it. But with Abe, I thought, look, he's international experience. I said, we don't treat our ambassadors like this. And he agreed with me. Mm-hmm. And to me, that was the value of being on the inside. I'd rather risk my career being on the inside before something happens than have to be on the outside with a picket sign saying you should not have done it. My passion for Africa began in this early 70s, and I went and I lived for 2 summers in Ghana, summer of 72, 73, then summer of 74 in Senegal. But in 73, something happened. I'd heard about this Organization of African Unity while I was living in Ghana. And I heard that they were having that particular year in 73, the annual meeting in Addis Ababa. I'd never been to East Africa, they really didn't interest me that much. But I was going to go to this meeting. In May of 73, I'm in Addis Ababa for a week, and it was a turning point. I never come in contact with really free Africans, who act like they had a history that was so proud of that informed their freedom. And then to see that they had this incredible Christian culture and that it predated colonialism, and they had this history of that segues into the Bible. Mm-hmm. So then a few months later, I'm working for TWA, being sent to Egypt to shoot a travel brochure. That's in September, near the end of September for 10 days. And I'm just like amazed. Nothing really prepares you or your imagination for actually being in the presence of a pyramid or temples with humongous columns that we have been taught that only the Greek or the Romans invented the concept, and these tombs, which are essentially people's apartments to eternity. It boggles the mind. So I've made it from Cairo and I'm into Luxor, and guess what? The war breaks out. Egypt attacks Israel. The October War breaks out. I can't get out of the country. The country is everybody's been mobilized. The trains are full of soldiers. I finally get back to Cairo, and my instinct tells me, as a photographer, as a Western journalist, I realize I'm the only journalist on the Egyptian side. And I try to call back to New York and get people interested in my photographing the Egyptian side. Nobody is interested. They're only interested in the Israeli side. I even tried to get the Egyptian government to let me go to the front line. They wouldn't do that, but they would take me to villages that had been bombed the day before by the Israelis. The long and short of it, I'm stuck in Egypt for 6 weeks instead of 2 weeks. But after my frustration, get over my frustration about not getting to the front, I didn't spend time to immerse myself into the ancient culture by going to the museums, by looking at stuff. So the Spirit put me in a place that allowed me to begin to soak up what was around me, because not only was it impressive, but it was African. To reclaim our sacred agency, to reclaim our sovereignty of history. You know, colonialism has really done a real job on all of the subjects, too much so that it has robbed us of all sense of belonging, of legitimacy on the planet. The only thing that's legitimate about Africa is resources, not the people. But colonialism of the mind started before that by the Greeks with the Bible. It's amazing how we people of African descent hate everything about slavery and colonialism except the Bible. And the Bible has been the most effective tool to pacify us and to separate us from our memory, and therefore separate us from our sense of worth. It is this is something I've come to learn while doing this work at the end of the work. But what my thing in the beginning was to reclaim this history. Because in spite of what is written on paper, our ancestors, the ancient Egyptian or Comitian people, we have to look at, if you just look at their glyphs, their writing, you realize that these were the smartest people ever to exist on the world. What they produced that still haunts our present shows that they also were the most prolific people on the world. Now, and they were the first people to even chart a conversation between the human and the divine. But we wouldn't know that if we listened to how they interpret it to us by our enemies. We will only know that by going and seeing for ourselves what they have left on the walls, because somewhere in the miracles of their thinking, they must have known that that history would be lost and we would forget. That's why it's chiseled in stone. That's why it's hidden away, chiseled away in stone and tombs. Well, no family exists in this world without the presence of a female. In the Egyptian world, nature was very important, and part of nature is a woman, and she's very important. Our men must have a wife, and they had a son, and that son is son as in S-U-N as well, because Amen represents the force behind the sun. The Mut, the wife, is a heavenly force that you see reflected in the moon, and then the sun itself is the one that has the earthly presence. That came from there in Egypt. There are two holy families. One is that one, and the other holy family deals with where the issue of Christ came from, and that's called the Abydos holy family, and that's the one people know most about, because that one you may have heard of the story of Isis and her husband Osiris. Osiris was an agronomist. As these agronomists all have to finally develop, hey, agriculture to such a state that, hey, in the African heart, let's share this with other people. So they can have peace among themselves, because what people fight over mostly is the shared resources. Let's do this. Osiris says, I'm going to leave my country in the command of my wife, and I'm going to go abroad and spread this message. And I'm going to come and I'm going to return after I share this with the rest of the world. While he's away, his brother Seth, who's jealous of his power, pulls a coup. The fight between two brothers pulls a coup, deposes his wife Isis from the throne. She is left to scrounge around. What skills does a royal woman have? Osiris returns. He comes back. His brother apologizes, said, the woman couldn't do it, whatever. But his brother didn't give up on killing him. He comes up with an idea to kill him. And once he kills him, it's not enough. He chops the body up into 14 pieces. He dismembers the body of his brother. The wife finds out in her mourning, she cries out to heaven, please help her find these pieces of her husband so she can give him a decent burial. With the help of the spirit, she finds these pieces. She then puts it back together like a jigsaw puzzle, and she wraps it up. This becomes the first mummy in the world. Then she is a virgin. They never had children. She begs heaven for a baby from them. She's allowed to take the form of a bird and hovers over the private parts of Osiris and collects his seed. And then she gives birth to this baby, the first impossible birth on record, the first immaculate conception on record. Egypt had an interesting career with Greek, all the Mediterranean people who came to Egypt to study medicine, study architecture, study all the sciences. And over time, these people became jealous of Egypt and decided that, hey, they should take it over. Alexander, the Greek, who started the Greek occupation, is not the first one. Before then, you had, Persian and Assyrian and Hyksos, what have you. But over time, the Greek tried to learn as much as they could from the Egyptians. If you read Herodotus, you will see where the priests who were in charge of educating the people, in charge of passing the culture along, refused to give information to Herodotus. From time to time, he'll say, the priest, wouldn't give me this information, or he tries to make the information unreliable, because what was happening in the society was this. As the Greek began to take over the Egyptian life, they started taking over the levels of operation. They reduced the priesthood. They took away their rights to make records for marriages, for deaths, the rights for you to be buried. I mean, you couldn't make a tomb without the permission of the king. You had to have, green slips for that. They gradually took over all that. They turned their temples into military garrisons, and they restricted the people movements, essentially turning the people in their own land into, like South Africa, apartheid. That's what the Greeks are. That's what the Greeks did to Egypt. He's right, because, language is built upon construction, and construction is built upon ideas. The Egyptians were very much in love with concepts and ideas. And if you go into their construction ideas, you have to have a reference for nature. You have to have an appreciation of the bounty of nature and of each other in ways that other languages, especially languages of the invaders, are always diminutive. There's a certain kind of so you begin to absorb their culture and their cultural references based upon their languages. There's no, and that's, and so people say, okay, we do this because it facilitates power or facilitates commercial interests, but it also scrapes away a sense of wholeness, and it reduces you. So he's absolutely correct, and good luck on that. I must say one other thing about our people, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, is that, as great as they were, and they existed for 7,000 years. But if one wanted to criticize them, or say there's a fault line, the fault line was that they were pacifists. They were essentially Buddhists in terms of relationship to nature, but that pacifism would cause them to try to absorb invading armies and convince them to convert to their way of seeing. And that worked for many, thousands of years, because people were all taken with this place. It was like walking to a fantasy land of heaven, because they were so much about that. The other thing I want to say is that in language and in patriarch religion, because originally we were talking about in Kemet is a religion where the divinity of nature, and patriarch religion bifurcated off into a religion into humans, into men. But it struck out the woman right away, the divinity of the woman. And it brought about all this foolishness about, a man giving birth, and foolishness that we people know is foolish, but in our minds, but somehow we've been convinced to ignore that. In the late 1700s, Napoleon had this bright idea that he was going to invade Egypt, which he did. Luckily for Egyptologists, he was convinced to take along a lot of these specialists and these draftsmen who could go and record all of the antiquity sites in Egypt and all of the land. So people went and they spread out. The army went one way, these guys went another way, and they recorded every antiquity site that was there. They recorded the plants, the animals, great. And the army found what we recall the stone, the trilingual stone, the Rosetta Stone. While he was there, though, he made a mistake, a strategic military mistake. Instead of allowing his fleet to remain out in the ocean, he commanded they all had to be in the harbor. So an English patrol came by, saw them all in the harbor, and they came in blazing. They destroyed his whole fleet. So he had no means of escape. So then his army, then the English invaded on top of his invasion, causing his army, after he had conquered the Mamelukes, the Egyptian power, the British came and conquered him. And then they had to divide the spoils. It's okay, what is this stone? What is this? We're taking this, you take that. So the Rosetta Stone they took from the French after they were allowed to make a rubbing of it. But what they had also was all this research that had been done that we were allowed to keep, and they brought that back, and Napoleon published that in these, I think, 12 or 14 volumes of humongous size. They're probably a foot, no, they're probably 18 inches by 40, humongous plates. But these plates and these books became the information for other Europeans about this place called ancient Egypt. And that excited the imagination of the European about ancient Egypt. And when and then later, his embassies were important because they began the extraction. With the permission of the Arab rulers, they began the systematic extraction of all of these monuments out of Egypt. The Palace de Concorde, you see the obelisk came out of Egypt. All of the stuff in the Louvre came out of Egypt with the permission of the Arabs at that time, because of this awakening that Napoleon's researchers has brought about. So then every nation, what is England, Germany, everybody jumped in. This is the place to go. This is the stuff to do. And it's all because of Napoleon. It's allowed us to bring back the voice of the ancient Egyptians, because and the reason it's so important, the only reason it works, because it's trilingual. So you had the ancient Egyptian glyphs, you had the Greek, and you had what was called Demotic, which is like a common way of writing. So they had to backtrack through the Greek to get to the glyph, the hieroglyphs. So the British was doing this. They had that great linguist working on this, and the French was doing it too. But the French, Champollion had an edge on them. He had a knowledge of Coptic language. And the Coptic language was what the Egyptians somehow hid the knowledge of their hieroglyphic language inside. It became the envelope for the Coptic language. So the sounds were there, and some of the words were there, enough to give him an edge that he could then, that Champollion could break it. Who have been oppressed, and they say that they are descendants of the ancient Egyptians, and that can mean many things, but they're Africans, decided that they did not want to give up on the things that have now been banned by the politicians. So they found a way to hide it. And they hid the knowledge of so much that they could pack into behind developing words in their own language, Copt, that was an envelope, that became an envelope for the ancient Egyptian language. Now, they did not realize, over time, they lost memory of what they had done. But Champollion, the brilliance of Champollion is that he, as he began to study the glyphs and trying to find the matching between the Greek and the glyphs, he began to understand that some of that was being resonated in the Coptic liturgical service. So then he went to study the sounds of the liturgical service and the meanings, and that allowed him to pull this together. The women of Nubia, we have more rulers, female rulers in Nubia than you had in Egypt. And they were called Kandakes, Kandake. The Bible, in the English tradition, corrupted it. You may have heard of the story of Candace, Queen of Sheba, so it says in the Bible, where they got it all messed up because they could not translate the K. Instead of saying Kandake, Kandake, they do the Candace, you see? And they did not understand that Sheba, which is not her name is Makeda, but Sheba was the name of the royal city in Yemen that was part of the Aksumite Empire and was their summer retreat. So, but you wouldn't know this unless you know Ethiopian history, because the British propaganda is so dense and so strong. But you know, the Nubians are cousins of the Ethiopians, ancient Aksumites. And the reason and that's a very good natural reason for this. The Ethiopian culture is a Highlander culture. People live in the mountains 5,000 to 15,000 feet above sea level. You can't really wrap your head around that unless you've been there. Us who live at sea level, when we go to Ethiopia, if you try to run the first 2 or 3 days, you will give out of breath. After the first few steps, you couldn't make it because the air at that altitude is so thin. That is why East African runners, when they come to run in any of the Western marathons, that's why they beat everybody, because they're down where the air is thick. So it's like being on steroids. So they can outrun everybody. Because when you're in Ethiopia, you see these kids running in the morning, up the mountains, all over the place, all day long, building their strength to be competitive. Now, get back to the women. So the people, ancient culture of Ethiopians, of the Oxumites, believed in the divinity of nature. And how do we know that? Because two things. First, if you look at the biblical story of Sheba going to visit Solomon, you would know that when she came back years later, she converted her country to Judaism. The Ethiopian history tells you all about that. But she turned her back on the faith of her fathers. What was the faith of her fathers? There are remains in Ethiopia of temples that are made out of stone, temples with columns. But the most important thing that speaks to that is the obelisks that are left behind in the ancient royal city of Aksum. The obelisk, and there's only two places on the planet and in Africa where you have obelisks. One is at the start of the Nile in Ethiopia, and one is at the foot of the Nile in Egypt. Their shapes change, but their structure essentially is the same. So the obelisk is a solar device that's about connecting heaven to earth. The Ethiopians did it by, the Egyptians do it with a pointed top that reflects the sun as it goes across the slants. The Ethiopian does it with a round top that reflects the rising and the setting of the sun, but with a little arrow, with a line in between, hitting the horizon. Now, the culture of the ancient Aksumite period, people simply migrated down the river. When a river starts at 6,000 feet in Ethiopia, it continues to drop into Sudan, drop into Egypt, and drop into the Mediterranean. So the migratory route, the expressway, is the Nile River. You just follow it down. So people came down the river to search of other places. They brought their belief system with them. They brought their culture with them. They settled into Sudan. So the Sudanese, the ancient Nubians, are the cousins of the Aksumite Ethiopians. The ancient Egyptians are the cousins of the Aksumites and Ethiopians. And they brought down this belief system. Now, the Egyptians refined this belief system far beyond what we know about the ancient Aksumites. Now, I say what we know, and this is why. The Egyptian stuff we know because it's in a dry climate. Records and artifacts, the enemy of records and artifacts is bacteria. Dry climates hold things together. In Ethiopia, where it rains 3 to 4 months out of a year, you have a lot of bacteria. So you have a lot of destruction of things that humans have made that have nothing to do with anything except the forces of nature and wars. Wars have done a lot to destroy everything. As I read Ethiopian history of people along the Nile, every generation, every 40 years, there's always a breakdown in central government, and then there's civil wars. Those civil wars have destroyed a lot, but it haven't destroyed the basic belief system of the people. That's kept them together. Now, to deal with the issue of the supremacy of the woman, if you study anything about Egyptian religion, it starts with the sun. Then after the sun, you get Amen, because it's the force behind the sun. But they had something else that you see only in their tombs, and that is the image of a black woman. The black of space becomes a woman's body, and she takes the yoga position of a downward dog over the planet. Her hands and her feet are on the solar poles, not the magnetic poles, not the north and south, on the solar poles where the sun rises and sets. So her arms are angled down on the western part of the planet, and her feet are in the east. So when the tired sun goes for sunset and needs to be recharged, her arms become like a runway, and the sun goes up her arms and she swallows it. There it starts as 12 hours of being recharged in her body overnight. And because her dress is made with holes in it, you see the twinkling of the light of the stars as it travels through her body. Mm-hmm. And then because her foot is on the eastern horizon, She gives birth to it the next morning with the help of the power of Amen. Then she gives birth to the sun, which is the male active force which animates everything else in creation. But the female force, the nursing force, the birthing force is the black matter of night. And that is the body of a black woman. That is heaven to them. Now, tell you how much they believe in this. When they die, when you die in ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, you have a casket, and the top of the casket may have a picture of you. But underneath that casket top is always a picture of Nut outstretching her arm, welcoming you back home. First of all, when the invaders and the colonizers came to Egypt, they were struck too, because they had seen, they were seeing what Napoleon had produced, but it ran against their narrative of these ignorant Black people who needed to be civilized. So they had to find a way to change, to create a cognitive diversion, a detour. So their detour was Egyptology. And that Egyptology then put forth the narrative that Egypt was not part of Africa. It was part of the Middle East. So Africans, and then the people who were there were also Arabs. They buried the Africans down in Aswan. And before that, they were along underneath what is now the Lake Nasser, because when Egypt freed itself from the British, when Nasser and those coup plotters freed themselves from the British, what we did not know is that our people were fighting for their independence in the southern part of Egypt. Nasser's answer to that was not to flood them out. So you have almost 1,000 miles of land that was occupied by people of African descent who got flooded out. And so with that combined with the English desire to make sure that African people could only have one example, and that example was that they were superstitious and ignorant and foolish, Egypt did not play into that narrative, so they had to separate it out. So that's one of the other things I found about doing this book. I became frustrated with the fact that Egyptologists stop at the border of Sudan and Africanists stop at the border of Sudan. None of them seemed to realize that there was a corridor, there was a bridge, that was an elephant in the room that nobody wanted to talk about. So in Sacred Nile, I breached that border. And I said, hey, the water connects you all. The culture connects you all. Africa is connected to Egypt. Egypt is connected to Africa. So once and for all, let's put that misnomer to rest.